Welcome to this edition of Ethical Sustainable Investment News and Analysis to Profit By. I'm Ron Robbins, an ethical investing pioneer for over 40 years, quoted in the Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch, the Globe and Mail, and numerous other media, and founder of the highly respected global ethical sustainable investing information website, Investing for the Soul. And please listen to my disclaimer statement at the end of this podcast. Now enjoy this podcast. Hello, Ron Robbins here. Welcome to podcast episode 19 titled ESG Bonds and Bond Funds, Stock Alpha and More for November 22nd, 2019, presented by Investing for the Soul. Investingforthesoul.com is your site for vital global ethical and sustainable investing news, commentary, information, and resources. And Google any terms that are unfamiliar to you. Also, you can find a full transcript, live links to content, and often bonus material to these podcasts at the episode's podcast page located at investingforthesoul.com/podcasts. Now to this podcast. Usually, when we think of ethical and sustainable investing, we almost always think about stocks. But for most investors who prioritize personal values in investing, ESG bonds should also be a significant part of one's portfolio. So now let's get a little more into that. Incidentally, later in this podcast, I'll talk more about some new ESG stock recommendations and about ESG stock alpha, that is, how terrifically well ESG stocks are doing. One interesting but overlooked debt asset class for ethical and sustainable investing, particularly in the US, are non-profit municipal bonds. Karen Hube, in an illuminating article titled Future Returns, ESG Investing in Non-Profit Municipal Debt, provides insight into this. The article appeared in Barron's Penta pages. In her article, Ms. Hube quotes Buck Stevenson, Managing Director and Portfolio Manager at Silvercrest Asset Management Group in New York. She quotes him as saying that municipal bonds issued by small non-profit groups working to bring about change in their communities can satisfy investors' growing appetite for impact investing ideas while paying yields ranging from 4.5% to 6%. Community hospitals, charter schools, and organizations providing mental health care and veteran services are among the groups that are typically structured as non-profit organizations with 501c3 status and can issue debt to raise funds for improvements, new facilities, equipment, and other needs." End quote. And interest received by investors in this type of debt in the US is often exempt from personal taxes. So real after-tax yields can sometimes be pretty good. Another article on ESG bonds and funds is titled How Advisors Use ESG Bond ETFs by Laura Krieger on the ETF.com site. Ms. Krieger interviews several ESG analysts and portfolio managers to get their picks on ETFs comprised of ESG bonds. She first quotes Johan Claesson, EVP and CIO of Horizons Sustainable Financial Services. Mr. Claesson likes the Van Eck Vector's Green Bond ETF, the New Veen ESG US Aggregate Bond ETF, the Sage ESG Intermediate Credit ETF, and the Invesco Taxable Municipal Bond ETF. Another interviewee, Maya Philipson, principal of Robasciato and Philipson, recommends the PIMCO Intermediate Municipal Bond Active ETF. Then Scott Arnold, partner and portfolio manager at Impact Folio, talks about how he also likes the Nuveen ESG US Aggregate Bond ETF, and on a more riskier level, Mr. Arnold likes the new Nuveen ESG High Yield Corporate Bond ETF. Regarding riskier ESG bonds and funds, ETFtrends.com ran an article titled "High Yield is Making Its Way into ESG Investing" by Ben Hernandez. He writes, "The search for yield is certainly a global phenomenon, given the low rates offered in government debt around the world. It opens the doors for ESG funds to shine by offering high-yield bond options, as in the case of BlackRock's iShares Euro High Yield Corporate Bond ESG UCITS ETF and the iShares US Dollar High Yield Corporate Bond ESG UCITS ETF." End quote. The article also has the following quote: "As evidence increasingly shows that sustainability-related factors can help investors build more resilient portfolios, we are moving into an era where sustainable investing will be the standard way to invest," said Megan Muldoon, head of sustainable investing EMEA at BlackRock. End quote. It should be noted that applying ESG and sustainability criteria to high-yield bonds does have a chance to improve the quality and performance of high-yield debt in a portfolio. However, generally, high-yield ESG bonds are still riskier than better-rated bonds. For a deeper inside look into ESG bonds and funds of the high-yield variety, I refer you to this article, "Looking Under the Hood of an ESG-Focused High-Yield Bond Fund." It's by Jeff Benjamin at Investment News. Mr. Benjamin interviews Tim Leary, lead manager of the RBC Blue Bay High Yield Bond Fund. The fund's portfolio consists of high-yield ESG bonds. Mr. Leary, commenting on his fund, says that the $54 million fund, which was launched in 2012, has an expense ratio of 58 basis points and a 5-star rating from Morningstar. It has gained 13.7% from the start of the year, beating both the benchmark and the category average. End quote. Additionally, he does have this warning about his and other high-yield funds, euphemistically often called junk bond funds. Quote, "The leverage finance markets and high-yield markets in general are a risky place to invest because they tend to be more opaque." End quote. Furthermore, Mr. Leary says this about his fund, that from a sector standpoint, we tend to be overweight financials, as well as financial services companies, cable and media names, both from an ESG perspective, but also from an overall view. We are materially underweight energy, metals, and mining and utilities. End quote. Also, you should know that there's a big debate about greenwashing when it comes to ESG bonds and funds, most especially of the high-yield variety. So, talk to your advisor before investing in them. Turning our attention back to ESG Stock Alpha, John Sizer outlines 25 investments that make you feel good while you make money. His article was reposted on Yahoo Finance from Go Banking Rates. Most of his picks are typical of what you might find in most ESG stock indexes and funds. Now, I'm not going to read all 25. You can see all of them, as well as a link to his article that describes his reasons for his choices, by going to this episode's page at investingforthesoul.com/podcasts. However, his picks are wide-ranging and include Best Buy, Voya Financial, Beyond Meat, and Tesla, Intel, and Ecolab. The following two articles talk about how our trend towards vegetarianism and veganism are having on food industry trends and food-related stocks. The first article is Americans, especially millennials and Gen Z, are embracing plant-based meat products, by Cheryl Kirschenbaum and Douglas Buller on the Green Biz site. These researchers find that, quote, with debate over the impacts of meat production intensifying, we have been tracking U.S. attitudes related to plant-based alternatives through Michigan State University's Food Literacy and Engagement Poll. The results reveal a growing appetite for plant-based meat among consumers, especially millennials and Generation Z. Our survey found that during the previous 12 months, 35% of respondents had consumed plant-based meat alternatives. Of that group, 90% said they would do so again. Among those who had yet not eaten plant-based meat alternatives, 42% were willing to try them, while 30% of that group remained unwilling. We also identified very significant generational differences in attitudes. Nearly half, 48% of respondents under 40, were already eating plant-based meats, while just 27% of those aged 40 and over had tried these products. End quote. The second post comes from Interactive Investor with the title, Why This $5 Billion Stock is Not Just for Vegans, by Rodney Hobson. Mr. Hobson focuses on the extraordinary stock alpha of Beyond Meat's stock price. It soared from its IPO price of $25 to about 10 times that and is now back to around $80. His comment is, there's no shortage of rivals making vegan alternatives to meat, and competition is likely to intensify. However, those companies with a solid base and proven track record are ahead of the game. Beyond Meat has been going for 10 years now. End quote. And finally, here's a story to cheer every ethical and sustainable investor. It's by Brendan Kofi, who I've previously quoted talking about ESG stocks, and here is talking about the remarkable stock alpha that ESG stocks are having this year. Writing for Forbes.com, his post is titled, ESG stocks are beating the S&P by 45% this year. Yep, he says that, I quote, ESG funds are raking in the dough in 2019, pulling in $13.5 billion in new investor money in the first 3 quarters of this year. Of course, it's in the US, according to a recent report by Morningstar. But how is the typical ESG portfolio doing? It's handily besting the S&P 500, returning more than 32% to the S&P's 22% through October. That's a 45% outperformance. End quote. So, as one famous stock market commentator says, stay with the drill. Okay. Well, these are my top news stories and tips for ethical and sustainable investors over the past 2 weeks. Again, to get all the links or to read the transcript of this podcast and sometimes get additional information too, please go to investingforthesoul.com/podcast and scroll down to this episode. And be sure to click the like and subscribe buttons in iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you download or listen to this podcast. And please click the share buttons to share this podcast with your friends and family. That way you can help promote not only this podcast, but ethical and sustainable investing globally and help create a better world for us all. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions about the content of this podcast or anything else related. A big thank you for listening. Come again, and my next podcast is scheduled for December 6th. See you then. Bye for now. Learn how to create a simple portfolio reflecting your personal values by taking my 1-hour tutorial. Go to investingforthesoul.com/podcasts and click the link in the right-hand column for my DIY Ethical Sustainable Investing Pays tutorial. Now, I'll mention in the podcast if I have any direct interest or holdings in companies or securities I'm talking about. Furthermore, any news, opinions, analysis, or other information offered by myself, as well as references and information to or from other external sources in this podcast, is provided as general market information and should not be relied upon and thus does not constitute investment advice. Investors should consult their own licensed investment professional before making investments. Also, I will not accept liability for any loss or damage, including without limitation any loss of profit, which may arise directly or indirectly from use of or reliance on information in this podcast. Do contact me at ronr@investingforthesoul.com. Signing off, this is Ron Robbins.